Welcome to Dying in Grace, the program that I'd like to bring someone from our community, a specialist, an expert, or someone with a heartfelt story to share that with us. This week, I'm delighted to have my friend, Rabbi Arthur Gross-Schaefer. Thank you, Arthur, for being with us.
It's a definite pleasure to be here.
Well,
thank you.
So, you're a rabbi, and I would like you to talk a little bit for people who don't know the Jewish faith, a little bit about how do Jewish people hold death and dying, and how does it work for them? You know, I know some people, every religion has its own views and practices. Can you just give us a glimpse into how Jews hold death?
So that's a large topic.
Yes, and you have to get it done in 10 minutes.
So let me talk about the rituals, some of the rituals, and that will help explain the larger picture.
Okay.
So, first of all, death is a normal part of life.
Yes.
So it's not to be feared. And therefore we have certain ways of reminding people about that. So for instance, after a funeral, and we go to a home to have food, the tradition is to have round food. So
food.
So you'll see a hard-boiled egg or lentils, or in California, bagels. But to remind us that death is a natural part of life. So we have symbols that remind us of those things. We also have symbols that say to us, when you're at a cemetery, you want to focus on death, yes. But when you go back to the home, understand you take what you've learned from that person, their character, their values, the memories, but use them in your life. So when you go back to a home after a funeral, there's generally a station to wash your hands without soap. So it's not about a physical washing. It's a spiritual connecting from where you were focusing on death, now focusing on life, on memory. As if to say, as long as we remember, we give that person's life in our life. So the memorial prayer that you'll actually say never mentions death, only mentions life, as if to remind us again, tell the stories, keep that person alive. And we'll even plant a tree at people's homes. And often it's grandpa's tree or grandmother's tree, always a fruit tree. So when years later, as the kids grow, grandkids grow, whatever it is, they can take a fruit of grandpa or grandmother, and then they tell stories. So it's a way of remembering those people. And one more thing, and we'll go back to the funeral itself. In our tradition, there are actually 4 times during the year, and actually a 5th time, but I'll explain the 5th one in a second, where the ritual says, remember. So it's called a Yizkor. So all of our pilgrimage festivals, we have 3 of them, and then high holidays, there's a special service of just remembering someone who has passed. And the 5th time is you remember someone on the date of their death. As opposed to in America, we remember people on the date of their birth, Abraham Lincoln as an example. We do on the date of death, the statement being that birth is the potential, and death is when we see what that person's life was about and what story we want to carry with us about their life. So those are some of the concepts that are very critical. And maybe just 2 more rituals. When someone dies, the tradition is never to leave the body alone. So we always have someone there. So even if it's overnight, let's say at a mortuary, we'll often have someone there just saying psalms, just being present. And then when the ceremony is over at the cemetery, we don't have strangers lower the coffin and cover the coffin. We, the friends and family, do that. So at the end of a service, if you've been to a Jewish service, the coffin is lowered, and then the shovels are put out, and the family's invited to put the dirt on. And while it's hard, it's also a catharsis. When my father passed away, my brothers and I, we spent time filling the grave, and actually the physicality of it was very powerful and very moving. So those are a few of the things I want to share.
Yeah, you know, I just, a couple things. When you said the physicality, we had another show about a friend of mine that did dance as a grieving thing. He's a choreographer. Yes. And I think many of us are disconnected from our bodies in so many ways, and there is something about when we have strong emotions, it goes through the whole system. And there's, when I hear what I think is the physicality of the doing, right?
Yes.
Because we can't do anything to change the fact,
Right.
but, and then there's something about that that seems to make the consciousness really get it. There, you can't deny anymore. Like, it's real. It seems to me it may help with the grief to actually be the one that's putting the dirt on, doing the burial of self, as opposed to letting other people do it for you.
You are exactly right. Part of the idea, I think, why the rabbis had you put the stones and so forth, was a statement that this is real, and be aware of it, and therefore after the cemetery, you have 7 days of Shiva, 7 days of mourning, where you are home, the grief, but the family's together. Ideally, people in the community bring you food for those 7 days. You have services at the home. But after those 7 days, you actually start to come back into the world slowly. So it's apparent. You maybe go back to work, but you don't go to parties. You come back in slowly because your grief is very real.
Right.
And they want you to face that, as opposed to, I'm okay, next day go back to work. They have a breakdown a few months later. It's about grief is very real. You need to face it, to understand it, and then hopefully with family to maybe process it, and then slowly come back into the world. And I think that's a lot of wisdom. So when someone's had a loss who's not Jewish, I will say, at least take some time off. You can leave work. Or if it's a student, I'm at a university,
Right.
I will say, you don't have to come back. I'll help you catch up. Please understand that's real. And don't presume you can just ignore it, because your body will tell you you can't.
Yes. My own experience of watching people in grief or being with people in grief is also the pressure from society. Many people are uncomfortable bearing witness to someone they love or care about being in pain. And so there is almost a pressure to get on with it, to not allow a natural process. And I've watched, and I totally agree with you, that people that pretend it's all is well find out all is not well. And often it's after the busyness subsides and all the people go away,
Right.
that people get smacked with what's really going on. So it's a really interesting thing. But you have some rituals. There's a thing, it's called the Unveiling. Is that right?
Right.
And that's after a year. Am I understanding that right?
Some say 6 months, a year. The idea being that you're changing status in how you have a relationship. When the death is so raw, it's very real, and then you kind of start to not be in the same place. And the unveiling gives a time for the family to come back together again, to do the unveiling, not a second funeral, but a time to be together. And you have the marker come out to mark the spot. And then from then on, every time you visit, you bring stones. Cemeteries hate us, by the way, for doing that.
Yeah, I wondered what the stones, why bringing a stone?
It says, I've not forgotten. I'm still remembering you, and you're still part of my life. So that's the tradition of bringing stones. A lot of cemeteries, even Jewish ones, make sure they have no stones anywhere near them. And
oh, really?
and
trying to thwart the tradition.
Exactly. And so I always give people stones. And very much at Unveiling, I have a tradition where everyone there has a stone, and they write something on it, and they'll put it around the marker. And everyone goes, I will collect and put them in a jar and give them to, let's say, the spouse or someone like that. So I have that sense of memory. So they won't always feel alone, because it is hard when a spouse dies. And they'll have a sense that the community is there. They'll also have a sense, too, there's another tradition of washing the body. And people may think, oh, that sounds strange. But here in Santa Barbara, we have a wonderful group of women that wash the bodies of women. Our men's group is not quite so organized, not so good, but it should be. But the idea being that it's a sign of respect and of honor. And when you do it, it feels strange initially. Then there's intimacy. And if they've had a disease, and you've seen them in pain, and now you see them without pain, and you realize there's a transition has taken place. But again, it's honoring the body as a vessel, a sacred vessel, and you treat that with respect and dignity. And it also tells you how you'll be treated.
Well, the other thing, as I have read some things about Jewish rituals, and is there is a great reverence for the body. I think it's accurate to say the body should be buried within 24 hours.
Yes.
That's part
you
of it.
try and do it quickly,
right?
But you don't do it in an insensitive way.
Right.
So for some who are more traditional, they'll bury the body 24 hours no matter what.
Right.
But I have a friend who was flying back to the death of his mother, and they would
so
not.
You're going to wait.
But they didn't. So you do want to wait. You want to be sensitive to what's going on.
Right. Right. But I think that it seems like this tradition, and would you say the words? What is the group that the tradition is called? The body washing.
Body washing.
Yeah.
A tahora.
Tahora.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a washing of the body.
And like you said, for a lot of people, that would be like, oh, that's again, many people have taken these rituals away, like you call the mortuary,
right.
and they do that.
They
we
take
don't
care of
touch the
everything,
body.
right.
Like the person took their last breath. We've got to get on the phone and get rid of the body instead of being with that temple that held that person.
Right.
So
and talking to the body and so forth, and the sense that also death is very real, but it's not the end. So from my point of view, the world. The spiritual world of this reality is a very physical reality,
right.
And the different worlds are more and more spiritual.
Right.
And so for me, in the Kabbalistic, the mystical tradition, is that when someone dies, they go to the next level, but these two levels are very porous. So there are times when I will see a bird and I feel that's my son who passed away, because he was also an ornithologist. He loved birds. And when I say that, I give people permission to feel another person, to feel their soul, their spirit. And I will talk to Avi sometimes, and I feel that connection. So I allow that.
And that belief system must inform your grieving process.
It does.
Because it's a transition versus an ending.
Correct. And it also, if I may, informs how I dealt, in Avi's case, with a young man who took Avi's life by drinking and driving and killing my son. That anger wasn't how I was feeling, nor revenge. It was, if I felt Avi's voice saying to me, I want you to live in the way that I always live, which is, how do I look for places of forgiveness? How do I look for places of people to find a better way for them? And so what I said to the young man who had killed Avi in the courtroom.
And he was a drunk driver, and your son was only 21 years of age.
Walking back to his dorm.
Right, at Brown.
At Brown. And I said to him, I will not forgive you today, because I believe that quick forgiveness is not helpful. Just like when you were a young kid, probably not you, but when I was a young kid, I did something wrong.
Oh, I did things wrong, absolutely.
My mother would say you're sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. And it didn't change anything.
Right.
So serious forgiveness for me and for the Jewish tradition is a journey. It's a very powerful journey, and it has 4 basic steps. And the first one is to acknowledge what you did was wrong, without conditions. I'm sorry, but no.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
No justification
Right.
for, yeah.
So I said that to him. You need to apologize to us. Even though you were drunk at the time, you chose to drink.
And drive.
And drive. You need to take responsibility for that. The second piece is understand the impact of what you did. So you need to ask me and my family, who wishes to engage with you, what it felt like to lose a son. So you understand the impact of your actions. Not from what you think they are, but from actually engaging. The third one is then to ask me a hard question, which is, what do you want from me? And I'll tell you now, what I said in the courtroom. What I want from you is to have a good life. I want you to be happy. I want you to have children, get married. I want you never to drive drunk again, ever. Even a small drink, nothing. But also, you silenced Avi's voice. I want you to find a way to give voice to Avi. Now we have our foundation that we're doing. That's our way. You got to find your way. But then the fourth step is that you have changed as a person because of this journey. And given the exact same circumstances, you would now act differently because it's not who you are anymore. In effect, you've earned a new name.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the 4 steps, and they're not so easy.
So he was also in his 20s, is that right?
25, I think.
Right, but young,
Yeah,
a young man.
Yeah.
And how did he receive the information? I mean, here he is in a courtroom, and that's got its own thing, and there's great guilt and all that. How did he hear your invitation for these 4 steps?
I don't think he could hear that.
Uh-huh.
I think he was too shocked.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to prison. I think that was,
Right.
and I said to him, that's what the state is imposing upon
Right.
you. I'm imposing these 4 steps, should you wish forgiveness and for us to talk. But his parents were deeply touched. They didn't expect that. And the judge was deeply touched. He said, no one's ever done that before. They're always angry. They wish the person would have a longer sentence, would have more punishment. That's not where I was coming from. That's not where I felt Avi wanted me to come from.
Well, the beautiful thing about the story too is, while you're forgiving someone who did you great harm, brought great sadness, and forever changed your life as well as Avi's, and yet there's great compassion. As a rabbi, when you have parishioners that feel that they have a burden of that, like, I'm gonna die, but no one, I'm so afraid he will never forgive me. I have a truth that I have never spoken because I'm afraid that it'll breach us. Or how do you encourage, because I think forgiveness is such an important part of dying in grace.
It is.
And so what counsel do you give your parishioners if they either need to be forgiven or someone comes to them asking for forgiveness?
Or also, what happens if someone has died?
That
and they
too.
never
did
forgiven?
it, right. That's right.
So I kind of give the same advice in all cases.
Okay.
I go, here's the Jewish tradition of teshuvah, which means repentance or return. Those 4 steps I just mentioned. And if you felt that you hurt somebody, even if they have died, I would have them write a letter to that person, express their feelings. And then about a week later, I go back to them and say, now I want you to write a letter, but now you are them responding to you. And those become very powerful documents of communication, because I do believe that there's still communication between the different worlds, the world of the dead and the world of the living. But I also talk about the need that when you are dying, to go to family members and have conversations with them. To say, I think I may have hurt you, and I'm really sorry I did. And allow for those conversations to be open. And allow people to have a sense of peace. I remember a cemetery, I believe it was, I forget when it was, but a young man kept saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And so I asked him, that was after the burial, what are you sorry for? He said, I'm sorry for never forgiving my father. And I said, then we'll do the letters. And that actually worked in that case. There's no guarantees, but I think communication and naming things and having a place of peace is critical. I think also, going back to when I talked to the young man who killed Avi, it took me out of being a jailer. If I hate someone or I'm angry at somebody, then they're in a jail I've made.
Right.
But then I have to be there to keep the jail.
Right, of course.
And it allowed me freedom.
Yes.
And sometimes all you need to do is allow someone to open up a gate. They don't have to step through it all the way, but sometimes it gives them a sense of peace as well, that they've at least opened the gate up. And sometimes really does move people.
Well, and I think there's the thing too is, and it was something it took me a long time to be taught and learn, was self-forgiveness too.
Yes.
To let myself off the hook, because I might have wronged you, and asked for remorse, asked for your forgiveness and did all that, and you forgive me, but I can't let myself off
Right.
the hook. And that has been a interesting journey for me to learn, the process of self-forgiveness, that whatever it is I'm holding against myself, I truly believe in that moment I did the best I could.
I think that's very powerful, but I also want to go back for a second. When I've worked with different religious traditions, different people, again, being forgiven too quickly does not allow for that person to go through it. When there's a pathway, a journey,
Yes.
I think that makes you go through it and do some self-reflection. I think that work is powerful and critical to really be able to forgive yourself.
Yes. Yes.
And so and that's why, a little side note, I'm working on an article dealing with people who may have committed acts of sexual harassment. Not rape, not to an extreme, they're not predators, they did
Right.
something. And I'm going to use a step or create a system for them to maybe go back and talk to people they may have wronged, and to allow for a way, how do you really have a conversation? And we need those.
We
need
do.
that.
And you know what it reminds me of too is the requirement in programs, 12-step programs,
Yes.
where making amends is the thing that changes the behavior. And I think, I think that Ira Byock, who's a doctor in the death and dying movement, has always said, like, the steps that people want to say at the end of their life is, I love you, I forgive you, please forgive me. Those are important things. And when we're at our last days and we may not have enough time to do the full-on journey, sometimes just the acknowledgement, speaking the truth of what went down, can really give people great freedom.
There's another tool I use as well called an ethical will. So as an attorney, I know how to draft wills for people, but that's about their property, that's not their assets.
Their possessions.
But an ethical will, if it's done right, and there's ways of doing it, and ways of doing it wrong as well. So it's not a document of guilt. It's a document of for someone who's dying, what have I learned through my life? And to create basically an heirloom for the family. And it says to them, your life had meaning, you had learned lessons, you can now be a teacher, and that will continue. And I often will talk with them too about planting a tree and what type of tree they would like. So I give them models of things that will continue in this physical world, but we'll speak of them in a very spiritual way and have that communication with them in a very spiritual structure.
And you do teach this in your classroom as well as with your clients, or?
Well, I do this with my congregation.
Oh, with the congregation.
'Cause remember, I'm a congregational rabbi, so I have my congregation.
That's right.
And I'm careful not to do that too much if I'm teaching Jewish traditions, but I'm a law professor, so I don't really bring that in too much.
Right, because you have lots of different hats you wear.
Lots of different hats. However, I will bring in, when people are doing estate planning or helping a family, the idea of the ethical will. I think that's very powerful. In addition, an oral history, that if they're still able to make an oral history of what it was like at their age to grow up, and because stories come out that will otherwise be lost.
Yes, and I'll share just briefly a story that I had heard from a hospice volunteer. She was visiting a gentleman who was in his 90s, and he started to trust her and confessed to her that as a boy he had poisoned his baby brother, that they had been outside playing and he had given him poison berries and the little boy died. And this woman had a conversation with me and we talked about it, and as it turned out, he went and started to talk. He told his grandson to start to tell the story, and his grandson did some research. And I remember as a kid we used to say stuff like these are poison berries,
right.
And the little boy, this man's younger brother, had died of like scarlet fever. It had nothing to do with it.
And he held that all his life.
His entire life. And I said to this volunteer when he came back and he understood that that was not true, I said, he's going to leave us. Next day he was gone.
Yeah.
And it was that thing, you know, so that forgiveness, the understanding, the stories that we hold on to. He got to die in grace because he confided the truth.
Yeah.
And I think that our fears about how the other person will receive our truth, and also our fears of really looking at who we were, stop us from opening the jail cell door,
right.
as you said earlier. And I think that whole idea of having meaningful conversations with one another is so much what we're trying to do here, to encourage people.
I think that's such a powerful story because I have experienced so many times people feel so guilty about what they did.
Right.
And they feel they'll never be forgiven. And very often when they tell the other person what they did, the other person goes, I don't even remember that.
Right.
Or it wasn't a big deal for me.
Right.
And so the need to communicate, to listen to each other is powerful, very powerful.
Yes, and that's, we'll leave it there. We'll leave it there. Arthur, every week we invite our guests to perhaps put a name in this book of living love. We say to live in hearts we leave behind is not to die. So perhaps there's someone's name you'd like to put in here.
Of course.
I would like to thank my crew, Elliot Jacobson, Michael Nicholson, TVSB, of course my guest, Arthur Gross-Schaefer. For those of you who want to watch other episodes of Dying in Grace, where previous shows are available on our YouTube station, Dying in Grace, or on our website, dyingingrace.com.